This is the Master Brewers Podcast, brought to you by the Master Brewers Association of the Americas, a volunteer organization dedicated to continually improving the products and processes of our membership since 1887.
Let's go!
Master Brewers brings you interviews with the industry's best and brightest in brewing science, technology, and operations.
Calm down, I'm moving too fast.
This Master Brewers podcast is proudly sponsored by Hopsteiner, a global leader in the hop industry focused on quality, sustainability, and innovation in new hop varieties and hop products. Contact our brewery sales team to provide you with the hop-related tools you need to craft your next great beer. For more information, visit hopsteiner.com.
Additional support provided by
Get to know Proximity Malt. We malt superior, European-style, low-protein varieties grown close to home in Delaware and Colorado. Domestically grown, precisely malted to style. With our team of seasoned experts and 2 brand-new malt houses, try what's really new in malt. Check us out at www.proximitymalt.com.
I hope we can get to a point where people are treating their beer like they treat their milk, but we definitely have a ways to go before we get to that point. We really work to do just-in-time production, where we're not making the beer any sooner than we need to, particularly with fragile beers like IPAs.
Every week we're analyzing depletion reports out of our distributor's warehouse to stay on top of what code they have in their warehouse and what code is going to be on the shelves.
This week on the show, the Pursuit of Freshness. David Oldenburg and Krystina Engebos talk about the commitments and resources required to leverage freshness as a competitive advantage. I've been wondering for about 15 years when consumers will demand fresh beer from retailers. Beer labels like Pliny the Elder, Stone's Enjoy By, and others have definitely helped raise awareness that freshness matters, but it still doesn't feel like we're quite there yet. What do you think?
No, I do not think the market is there yet, at least not in the places that I see very frequently. There's a lot of stale beer out there, beer that's past its best by date if it has one, or very old in any case, or warm storage. It just doesn't seem to be a real priority among retailers, which tells me it's probably not a high priority among consumers either.
How do you define freshness?
Well, I have a hard time putting an exact finger on that, but what it really came down to, and this is actually something I picked up at Siebel from one of the lecturers, but it's fresh until it no longer represents its brand. Is the way I've kind of put my finger on it. So there's, some beers can be very old and still represent their brand if they're a style that ages well. So you kind of have to say, well, when does, if your beer is called so-and-so's IPA, when does it no longer taste like so-and-so's IPA? And that's a little bit subjective, but I think that's the way I define it, is it's no longer fresh when it no longer tastes like the beer on the label.
When a brewery decides to really go after freshness, what are the areas to focus on?
Well, I've got 3 areas that we focus on. The first one is the packaging, the date codes, and just making sure that your whatever way you're labeling your package is meaningful as far as your best by date or your packaging date or whatever it is, and then just making sure that beer has the best chance to survive you can give it, which means getting the oxygen down, keeping the light out of the package, and just keeping that beer as fresh as it can be when it leaves the brewery. That's the first one. And then there's the planning and logistics area too, where you need to be, producing to order, sure that beer isn't sitting in your warehouse or in the distributor's warehouse any longer than it has to, and just making sure that your batch sizes are appropriate for the rate of sale of that brand and all that kind of thing. And then the third part, and this is the hard one if you're a brewery, the distribution and retail end, because you have a lot less control over that. But working with your distributors, working with the retailers, to make sure that the beer is kept as cold as possible, as long as possible, and is sold as quickly as it can be. And then once it gets into the customer's hands, I think it's really out of our hands at that point. But so I focus on those three: the packaging, the planning, and the distribution.
All right. Well, let's hear about the enemies of freshness. Hopefully everybody knows what they are already, but let's talk about them to make sure.
Yeah, well, I just kind of have a mantra that I have repeated in my head, which is time, temperature, oxygen, right? All those three are enemies of beer. And, if one of them's high, the other two better be low, right? So if your oxygen is high, but your beer is consumed within a few weeks, it's probably not a big deal, right? If your temperature is high, but only for, a day, well, that's probably not the end of the world either, but those three work together to steal your beer.
And then there's two more enemies that you haven't mentioned yet, right? Distributors and retailers.
Right? right. Distributors and retailers, and I suppose even consumers sometimes, right? They get that nice fresh beer and they throw it on top of their fridge and put one bottle in at a time, whatever. But yeah, definitely, distributors and retailers, absolutely.
In all seriousness, we can be our own worst enemies here. This is one of those plan to fail or fail to plan to fail scenarios, isn't it?
Right. Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, there's a lot of planning that has to go into this stuff, or else you just get into trouble where you're faced with either selling stale beer or dumping out beer, which is neither of us. Nobody wants to do any of those. We spend a lot of time managing inventory and forecasts from our distributors. We get the distributors to give us as much information as they can and will. That's never enough, honestly. But we try to do it anyway. And when they don't give us the information we need, we make it up ourselves based on our experience and our data. And hey, how much beer did they go through last March? If we don't know what they're going to go through this March, and we're constantly on them to give us forecasts, and we look at their inventory level in their warehouses as well sometimes. So there's a lot of that. We go through all the orders and all the forecasts every week to keep them updated, and they change a lot, so we need to react quickly. And then we really work to do just-in-time production, where we're not making the beer any sooner than we need to, particularly with fragile beers like IPAs. We try to not brew that beer any sooner than we have to, and certainly not package it any sooner than we have to. So we may hold a beer in a fermenter for an extra week, rather than packaging it that week sooner, even though we could, just because we want to keep it that much fresher. And of course, the packaging is where all the oxygen gets in and everything.
It's a very delicate balancing act. I mean, David talked about the forecasting, but it really is a lot of analyzing historical orders and taking into account any programming you have with retailers and just a whole variety of seasonality. And especially being in Green Bay, I'd be a liar if I said there wasn't a certain NFL team that affected our production and our distribution. So there's so many things to take into balance. And when David brings up that just-in-time production too, if something falls through on the distribution end or programming from retailers, and I'm basically talking about packaged product at this point, there's been times where I've had to go down to the bottling line and hit the e-stop button, essentially, and on Green 19 runs and say, stop, don't make any more, this isn't happening. Or I've had to beg David to put an extra 90 barrel batch of IPA into our production planner when we otherwise might not be able to fit it in. And it's a lot of quick reaction times, I guess, is is the best way to describe it.
Years ago, I was at a roughly 20,000 barrel brewery, and I remember going to a grocery store that was a short distance from the brewery and seeing our beer on the shelf that was, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 months old. And after making a very serious recommitment to freshness, we were finally able to get that down to well under a month and even a couple of weeks in some cases. But it takes a lot of resources, but it is absolutely achievable. Talk about what's been key in your pursuit of freshness.
I think a lot of times is it's a lot of number analysis, especially on my end of things, and David can talk more on like the quality side of things. But every week we're analyzing depletion reports out of our distributor's warehouse to stay on top of what code they have in their warehouse and what code is going to be on the shelves. And then a lot of times it's, having boots on the street, as the overused saying goes, and having people, our sales rep, staying on top of date codes. But you also don't want to become that distributor that's chiming in for every warm 6-pack at a retailer either. I mean, you have to put a little bit of faith in your relationship with your distributors, or you won't build that relationship either. So it's difficult to maintain that freshness attitude and yet still work in a distribution world where 10, 15 years ago, that craft beer wasn't even at the forefront of these distributors' minds. So the industry and the consumer is there's just so much disconnect, I think, from the end user and the retailers from the breweries.
Do you get those beer depletion reports and inventories? Are you getting those directly from the distributors, or are you relying on third-party software or IRI data or something like that?
You could use both. We get ours directly from our distributor. So every week, I'm analyzing how much of our IPA went out the door, and that has helped a lot with forecasting and planning. But yeah, you could use third-party softwares if you had that available to you.
It's a difficult balance between, you want your beer to be fresh and you want the distributors to take care of it, but you also don't want to be the difficult to work with brewery for the distributor either, because they've got so many brands, they're just overwhelmed for the most part, right, with different beer brands. And you don't want to be the one that's difficult to deal with. You want to be the one that's easy to deal with so that they are going to promote you, right? So they're not going to give you the placement if they know that every 2 weeks they're going to get a call about stale beer. So,
and if you're difficult to work with, you better have the hottest brand on the market that literally pulls itself off the shelves and walks out the door.
It's a difficult spot to be in as a brewery that cares about quality, because there's probably going to be some other brewery that cares less, or at least isn't as vocal about it as you are. And then all of a sudden that's the one the distributor wants to push, because, they make the same margin either way for the most part. So it's tricky.
There is one mandatory tool that any brewer who is serious about freshness needs. Talk about that.
Yeah. When we first started talking about going into packaging, they asked, well, how much money do we need for a lab budget? And I thought, well, a DO meter plus not much else. So no, we have a full lab, but most of that lab budget was just for a DO meter. And so I look at it as if you're buying a piece of packaging equipment, a bottle or a can or whatever it is, even if it's low end. You just look at that DO meter and as part of the expense of going into packaging. So if you're going to spend $80,000 on a low end canning machine, well, spend the extra $15,000 on the DO meter. It's just part of the budget. And these meters, you need to get one that's intended for finished beer, which means it's going to read in parts per billion. Maybe in the 1 to 2 to 3,000 parts per billion range as the top end. So we got that right away, and we use it at every step in the process. Right after any time after fermentation, we're checking it every time we move it at filtration, at packaging, and hopefully there aren't any other moves in there. But if there are, we check those as well, and just add up that total package oxygen, and we kind of know what we can achieve. And if there's an air leak somewhere, we know right away, and we can stop and find it. You kind of get your baseline established of what's normal for you, and then you can watch for anomalies so that you know if you have a problem. So yeah, it's key piece of equipment.
Yeah, talk a little bit more about how you use the DO meter in your brewery. Do you have any great examples of where it's really saved the day, or helped you chase down a leak or something like that?
We take our beer out of our fermenter, put it through our leaf filter, and then catch it in our bright tank. Right. So when we do that, we've got the meter continuously monitoring the beer as it goes in to the bright tank, and so we can watch for any leaks there. And what else has been really useful in that area is we've compared how much different variables affect the dissolved oxygen. So, for example, we've got the dosed leaf filter, and we've looked at, well, if we fill the dose tank this much with beer, we'll get less DO. Or we've noticed the difference when we've had a higher carbonation level of the beer going into the filter, and we've looked at what effect that has on the dissolved oxygen, and it's actually pretty significant. If the beer's got more carbonation in it, that beer in the dose tank is continually off-gassing, and that's really done a lot to keep oxygen out of the dose tank. So we've been able to just monitor what things we do and how much effect they're going to have on our oxygen content. So it's been great. So we can dial in our processes a little bit, and now our pickup is very low. So we check it coming out of the filter. Then once all the beer is in the bright tank, check it again, because when we figure out what we picked up in the bright tank itself, and we've been able to get that down quite low. And then we've also used that meter to establish our purging process for our bright beer tanks, and we do check the atmosphere in every bright tank with the meter after we do our purging, and we know how long it takes and how much pressure, and we've kind of gotten that process down. And then on the way into the bottle, we set it up again. We set it up just before the filler, and we just checked that the beer coming into the filler is nice and low, that there aren't any leaks in the line. That's a spot where we've definitely shut down a couple times and gone and changed out the gaskets or whatever because air was leaking in somewhere. So we've caught that a few times, where hey, shut down the filler, go find the leak, start up again. It sucks because you waste beer and time, but it's worth it if you keep the oxygen out. And then we check the bottles about once an hour or so. We pull a bottle off and look and make sure that we're not getting anything abnormally high in the bottle. And that's about as far as it goes. But it's been very helpful just so that we can get some of our processes really dialed in, and then make sure there's nothing weird going on.
Yeah, it's great. It's really some of the best money you can spend in a brewery of any size, really. Yeah, I've got a lot of great stories like that too. I mean, in one example, we took draft beer from something like 3 ppm down to 30 ppb just by adjusting a purge cycle on a keg machine that we knew was off, but we had no ability to dial it in without a DO meter previously. So
right,
it's amazing what you can do. Coming up,
there's going to be a date, and then we're going to have a QR code that you can scan, and you'll get more information upon scanning it, and we're going to see how that works.
I'm John Bryce, and you're listening to the Master Brewers Podcast from the Master Brewers Association of the Americas. Support for this podcast is brought to you by
ABS Commercial is a full-service brewery and parts outfitter. From our Raleigh headquarters to our Denver office, we proudly offer brew houses and fermenters from 3 barrels and up, yeast brinks, boilers, kegs, chillers, tri-clamp, and other stainless parts, all with the quickest delivery and lead times in the industry. Learn more at abs-commercial.com or call 877-BREW-ABS. ABS Commercial. We are brewers.
Additional support provided by
Whitcomb Selinsky McCullough PC serves all brewers in registering and protecting trademarks, navigating the label approval process, and assisting with OSHA inspections and safety compliance. Please go to wsmlawpc.com for more information.
Here's what's coming up on the Master Brewers calendar. District Northern Rockies meets March 1st in Bozeman. District Philadelphia meets at Flying Fish Brewing in Somerdale, New Jersey, March 8th. District Mid-South meets March 8th and 9th in Huntsville, Alabama. District Michigan meets at the Knickerbocker in Grand Rapids, March 21st. District Eastern Canada meets in Montreal, March 21st. District St. Louis also meets March 21st at Urban Chestnuts Grove location. Don't miss the Maintaining a Clean Brewery webinar, March 28th. Several districts meet the last weekend in March. District Texas is in San Antonio. District Mid-Atlantic is at Basic City Brewing in Waynesboro, Virginia. And District Midwest is at Rheingeist in Cincinnati. It's not too early to start making plans for the 2019 Master Brewers Conference. If you can only make it to one conference in 2019, this should be it. We're really mixing things up this time and heading to the Calgary Convention Center to see how Alberta celebrates Halloween. Check out the full calendar of events at mbaa.com for more details or to find a district meeting near you. Now back to the show. Any brewery that jumps on the freshness bandwagon usually ends up reevaluating their crown liners. What happened at your brewery? What was that like?
When we planned out our packaging brewery, that crown liner was the thing that I did the most research on out of all the equipment and all the materials. There's a lot of differences in those crown liners, and it's been a few years since I looked at all of them in detail. But there's a big difference in the rate of oxygen transmission through them. Now, of course, if you're canning, that's probably an even better solution. But for those of us that have bottles, you have to accept that there's going to be some oxygen creeping into that beer as it sits, no matter where it's sitting. There's going to be some oxygen sneaking under that crown liner, and you want to minimize how much it is. And so there's a bunch of different liners. And a lot of the vendors I found, and this is a few years ago, so maybe it isn't true anymore, but a lot of the vendors, the manufacturers of these things, were not real willing or able to provide the rate of oxygen transmission under their crown liners, and I thought that was kind of disturbing. So we went with one of the few that was able to provide it. And when we researched it, there's a bunch of different materials, and some of them they sell as quote unquote oxygen barrier liners, which have the lowest had the lowest rate of oxygen transmission, and those are not compatible with twist off bottles, which is unfortunate. But anyway, those were the ones with the lowest transmission rate. There was also ones that were sold as oxygen scavenging, meaning they were impregnated with something that had something that absorbed oxygen for you. So that's another way you can go. My reasoning was, well, you can impregnate the beer with an antioxidant if you're concerned about it, rather than your crown liner, and then use the crown liner that keeps the most oxygen out. But that was just our solution. I don't know if that's the right answer universally, but I guess my advice to anybody that's getting into packaging is well, first of all, go to cans if you can, but if you're going to bottle, take a good look at that crown liner. Don't just buy the first crown you see there. There's a lot of differences in that material. And then if you want to get into even more detail, there's stuff that's got to do not with oxygen, but with the absorption of some of the hop aromas and things like that in your crown liner. It's a really important little piece of the package, and I think a lot of people probably don't really give it much thought. But it's the most important part of your bottled package, in my opinion.
What would you like to say about date coding?
You want to go, Krystina?
I don't know. David and I always go toe to toe, and actually, this is like one of the biggest philosophical debates in our brewery to this day. I mean, I mentioned, and I'll say it again, about the craft consumer is evolving, and so you can sit back and say they don't know anything about freshness. The consumer doesn't know fresh or stale IPA comparatively, and then you look at bottle coding, and there's just so much information that can't be conveyed however you want to convey it. It's just not enough. Like, we have a we have a best consumed by date. So we tell our consumers that after this date, this beer no longer is fresh, which is kind of all-encompassing statement to make to someone that if they don't know much about beer and they are 2 days past this date code, then are they not going to purchase that beer off the shelf and they're going to turn and buy someone else's beer? Or do you have a packaged on date and let the consumer decide for themselves? But we've already expressed that, the consumer doesn't necessarily have all the knowledge at hand to determine if it's fresh. So it's this constant battle that we have about how to convey date coding to people. And yeah, it's a tough one. I would say if I had to pick my perfect date code, I would do a packaged on date and let Billy, Bob, and Katie decide if they're going to drink this IPA or not. If they think it's too stale for their palate, they're not going to buy it. But that doesn't mean that, other guy that's just getting into beer isn't going to enjoy it as well. So it's this back and forth.
See, and I look at it more as it's our job to help them with that, and rather than putting it on them to figure it out. And I don't know, it is tough because there's there's that philosophy of they can figure it out, and if they can't figure out whether the IPA is fresh, then maybe they just don't know the difference between fresh and stale, therefore they don't care. And I come back and say, well, if they buy your IPA, they may say, hey, and it's stale. They may not recognize that it's stale. They just may say, hey, I don't like this. I'm going to buy something else next time. So I look at it as, well, it's our job to give them the best chance of getting a good beer, and part of that is putting that hard deadline on the bottle. But I certainly that's the way I lean, but I certainly recognize that there's a lot of other philosophies out there, including not putting a date on at all or not making it human readable, because you don't want people to have a reason to not buy your beer. And I've gotten calls from people who have inadvertently bought beer that's past its deadline, and they think, or past its best by date, and they're wondering if it's safe to drink. And of course it is. But they don't know that, and you certainly don't want to have people think that they can't drink it or that it isn't safe. So it's a tricky situation. We're gonna have a slightly different approach when we go. We're going to be putting some of our beers in cans this year, and on those we have a slightly different approach. There's going to be a date, and then we're going to have a QR code that you can scan, and you'll get more information upon scanning it. And we're going to see how that works. So it's complicated. Is kind of the short answer.
Yeah, and so you said that you guys currently are using a Best Buy date. How do you go about determining what that Best Buy date is?
We it's essentially trial and error. We take a guess, and then we age the beer until that date, and then we taste it. and we decide again, does it represent its brand, right? So it's not looking to be the best example of that brand you've ever had, but does it still taste like the beer that it's supposed to be? What we typically will do is every bottling run we'll pull some beer that we'll pull the run, and then we'll save some of it for 2 weeks in a warm room, some for 1 week in a warm room, and some not at all. And we'll have the all cold sample, the 1 week warm storage sample, and the 2 week warm storage sample. And we base the dates on the 1 week warm storage sample, which I don't know how realistic that is, but we find that our IPA in particular, the 2 weeks of warm storage completely destroys it. So I saw no point in basing the shelf life off of that, because it would literally be a 2 week shelf life. So we base it off the 1 week warm storage sample, and doing that, we're able to get meaningful dates that are still feasible in the marketplace. But yeah, it's just continually simulating the storage and tasting it. When we're figuring out how aged a beer probably is, or how it's going to be, I do use an approximation of a day of warm storage is worth about a week of cold storage. And I picked that up from a presentation a long time ago by Charlie Bamforth, and I've just kind of used it, and we find that's more or less accurate for most beers, and it's a good rule of thumb. So, if we're talking about an end cap placement or something else where you're going to have warm storage, well, the beer is going to sell faster, which in itself is a good thing. So, if you can sell it, in a week on the end cap versus, 6 weeks in the cold storage, maybe you're actually better off in warm storage in that case. So I do use that 1 week warm is equal, or 1 day warm is equal to a week of cold as a rule of thumb for thinking about beer storage.
Oftentimes, there will be pressure from distributors or even other brands to have pull dates and best buy dates that are further and further out in the future. How do you push back against that type of pressure?
Well, yeah.
It's been challenging. It definitely, I feel like I've bared the brunt of that one for the last couple of years. But when we first came out with our IPA in bottles, there was a 60, then 75, and now 90-day coating on it. And, by the time we ship it across the state and it lands in warehouses on the western part of the state, there's so much code off of our IPA that, as a repercussion of this, their orders are smaller, which I guess is great because they're keeping less inventory on the floor. But, there's been a couple of times where some of our distributors just won't carry brands because they haven't performed as well as like our top brands, and the date coding wasn't kind enough to keep it on the shelves any longer. So yeah, we've had some brands yanked, and we've gotten some pushback about carrying it in different retailers. Some retailers didn't want to carry some of our brands because there wasn't enough coating on it. So you definitely it definitely comes back at you for that, but you just have to keep explaining to them what your freshness philosophy is, and then you also have to be very adaptable and very diligent when it comes to your forecasting and production to kind of make up for that.
Well, and one thing we have been able to do is, in some cases, we have lengthened the dates that we put on the packages. As we've gotten better at keeping oxygen out and done more tasting, we have been able to lengthen some of them. But we do have some beers that are still a 3-month code, and we can't seem to, there's only so much you can do to keep hop aroma and hop flavor in beer. So we haven't, some of our beers, our hoppier beers, are still on the 3-month coating, and yeah, we get some pushback. which is some of that is an argument for a bottled on date, I guess. But yeah, so it's not easy.
Why don't you talk about some of the lessons you've learned and changes you've made in regards to distribution and retail?
Well, first of all, it's as far as distribution goes, we haven't ever cut a distributor out or taken our beer away from a distributor because they've mistreated it. But we have altered our production schedule, so we will package our IPA the week right before our distributors are picking up. And we've now built a relationship with them where we know our outer line distributors are going to come once a month, and it's the second Monday of the month. And, that forecasting is so crucial to being able to produce things and not having it sit on our end. And we'll even, David and I will be going through the production schedule, and we've recently added some bright tanks. And he talked about the dissolved oxygen meter being extremely important, but I think if you have the ability to be flexible with your bright tanks is also significantly important, of significant importance. Adding 2 bright tanks allowed us to package some at one date, hold it in the bright tank for a week. It's not ideal, but you save, some time on that code before you package a huge run that's going to go across the state. So being able to be flexible at packaging is really, really important.
Yeah, we have, we're not strictly at capacity as far as our tanks go, so that gives us a lot of flexibility because you're not necessarily depending on that tank being emptied for the next batch. That's hugely helpful. So if you're right at capacity, it's a little trickier to be flexible like that.
That, and from a labor standpoint too, if your bright tanks are at capacity, there's that sense of urgency to get them emptied right away. Well, that takes people. You need people to keg, you need people to can, you need people to bottle. So if you are short on labor, also having an extra bright tank is helpful in that regard.
That was David Oldenburg and Krystina Engebos here on the Master Brewers podcast. If you like what you heard today, check out the District Milwaukee Presentations Archive, where you can download the Pursuit of Freshness presentation. That's under the Meetings tab, or simply type Pursuit into the industry's best search bar at MBAA.com. Did you know that Master Brewers now has a mobile app? TQ articles, podcasts, webinars, Ask the Brewmasters, and more, all in the same place. Search Master Brewers in the App Store to download it now.
Just like that one day, like everyone else did. Calm down, I'm moving too fast. And then I hit on the ground. Just like that one day when we came around then. Since there's that one thing that I should have told you, or maybe 2 things that you should have